My name is Emily Carter. I am 25 years old. And on the night of my sister's wedding, I tried to do the simplest thing, just blend in. The ballroom glowed with chandeliers. Guests whispered in polished gowns. And I carried a glass of wine, praying I would not make a mistake. But one slip was all it took. The wine spilled. And in a heartbeat, the smiles turned to stares. My sister stormed toward me, her hands striking across my face. And then, my father's voice cut the air. Calling me useless, hundreds of eyes locked on me. And I stood frozen. Abandoned by everyone who should have loved me. I walked out of that wedding with my hands trembling. And what happened after would uncover truths my family never wanted exposed. Stay with me until the end. Because once you hear what I discovered, you will never look at family loyalty the same way again. That was the moment everything began to unravel. But before it happened, I remember exactly how the night looked when I first walked into the hotel. I stood in the lobby of the Cherry Creek Grand Hotel, smoothing down the skirt of my simple navy dress and willing my hands to stop trembling. It was Olivia's wedding day, the one my mother had been planning and boasting about for nearly a year. And every detail glistened with perfection. White roses lined the staircases. A quartet played near the fountain. And guests in expensive gowns and tuxedos sipped champagne under chandeliers that seemed to float in the air. I wanted so badly to belong. Just for once. To be more than the forgotten daughter, standing at the edge of every family photo. My mother Linda swept through the room in a sequin gown, stopping every few feet to air-kiss her friends and praise her eldest daughter. Olivia was her pride, the crown jewel of the Carter family, the CEO of our restaurant group. The one who had carried the family name to the glossy pages of business magazines. At 31, she was radiant in her gown, her laughter echoing like polished silver. My father Robert stood near the back, stiff in a suit that didn't seem to belong to him. He had divorced Linda years ago, retreated to Boulder to run a coffee shop, and barely appeared at family events. Seeing him here unsettled me, but I tried not to dwell on it. I had promised myself that today I would not shrink. I was 25, old enough to stop begging for scraps of approval. I offered to help the staff carry trays, refill glasses, anything to show I was useful. The servers let me pour wine for a few tables, and for a moment I felt a flicker of belonging, as if maybe my presence had value. Balancing the heavy glass decanter, I moved carefully between the tables set with crystal and silver. My heels clicked against the marble floor, my smile fixed, my heart steadying with each step. Guests murmured politely as I approached, some offering their glasses, others looking past me as though I were invisible. I leaned toward a table near the head of the room where Olivia's college friends sat, their dresses shimmering. Just as I tipped the decanter, the heel of my shoe caught the edge of the carpet. The bottle tilted, and a stream of deep red wine splashed across the white linen, bleeding quickly toward the centerpiece. Gasps rippled around me. My hands shook as I tried to steady the bottle. But a few drops arced upward, landing against the satin of Olivia's gown as she passed behind me. The room froze. Olivia's voice cut the air, sharp and unforgiving. "What did you just do?" Her hand lashed out before I could speak, the crack of skin against skin echoing through the silence. My cheeks stung, the shock flooding every nerve. She stood inches from me, her face twisted in rage, eyes blazing as if I had destroyed her entire world with one careless mistake. "You always ruin everything." Worthless. I felt dozens of eyes on me, some wide with shock, others narrowing with judgment. No one moved. My mother stood near the dais, her lips pressed in a thin line, refusing to meet my gaze. And then my father's voice cut through the stillness. "Useless." His tone was heavy with contempt, louder than the music that had stopped mid-note. He didn't even look at me fully, just tossed the word like a stone. The weight of it crushed me more than the slap. Years of doubt and hunger for acceptance collapsed in a single moment. I felt heat flowed me face, tears threatening to blur my vision. But I would not let them fall here. Not in front of these people who had waited to see me stumble. I set the bottle down with trembling hands. My throat closed. Words lodged where my dignity once lived. Chairs scraped as guests leaned away from me. The murmur of whispers rose, cutting sharp as knives. Without another word, I turned toward the double doors at the edge of the hall. Each step felt heavier, my shoes striking the floor in rhythm with the pounding of my heart. No one stopped me. No one called my name. Outside, the evening air wrapped around me, cool, against my burning skin. The sounds of laughter and music resumed faintly behind the closed doors, as if nothing had happened. I kept walking past the valet, past the rows of luxury cars, down the quiet street, until the glow of the hotel lights faded. I did not know where I was going, only that I had to get away. My face still burned, my chest ached, and the word my father had hurled at me echoed with every step. Useless. I pressed my arms around myself, forcing my feet forward into the night, not yet knowing that this moment, as humiliating and painful as it was, would mark the beginning of something I had never dared to imagine. The streets of Denver stretched out ahead of me, quiet and dim, the kind of silence that pressed on your chest and forced you to hear your own thoughts. My heels clicked against the pavement, and each sound seemed to echo that word, still lodged in my heart. I wrapped my arms tighter around myself. Shivering though, the night air was mild. I wanted to disappear into the darkness, away from the sting on my cheek, away from the looks that had cut through me like glass. My mind pulled me backward, not just to the wedding, but to all the years that had carved this wound long before tonight. I was 10 when the world split in two. My parents divorced in 2012. And the story I heard was simple. My mother Linda wanted to expand the Carter Dining Group, the chain of restaurants she and my father had started together. My father, Robert, insisted on quality over growth, on keeping the business small and honest. Their arguments filled the house like thunder, shaking the walls until one day he was gone, his side of the closet empty, his voice fading to memory. Linda and Olivia stayed in Denver, taking over the restaurants, rebranding them into sleek, high-priced dining rooms where white linen and polished waiters defined success. I saw their faces in local magazines, smiling at ribbon cuttings, accepting awards. My father moved to Boulder and opened a small coffee shop on a side street. I only knew because I overheard Linda mutter it once, her tone dripping with disdain, as if the word coffee itself was a failure. From then on, it was clear where loyalties lay. Linda clung to Olivia as if she were the golden child, the savior of our family's name. Every family dinner, every holiday, every conversation circled back to Olivia's achievements, her promotions, her speeches, her photographs with people whose names carried weight. When I tried to mention my own accomplishments, Linda's eyes glazed over as if I had spoken a language she did not understand. I had chosen a different path. While Olivia strutted through boardrooms, I found myself drawn to community work. By college, I was volunteering with nonprofits that helped immigrant children adjust to life in Denver. The work filled me in ways I could never explain to my family. Watching a child smile when they learned a new word, or seeing them write their name in English for the first time, meant more to me than polished dining tables ever could. Linda did not see it that way. She told me I was wasting my education, that I could do so much more if I joined Olivia at the company. Her voice was always sharp, but what cut deeper was her silence after. The look that said I was not worth arguing with. Olivia was crueler in her own way. She laughed. She called me the dreamer, her tone dripping with pity, as if helping children was a phase I would eventually outgrow. The truth was, I swallowed it. I kept my head down, telling myself that if I worked harder, if I showed up to every event, if I smiled long enough, maybe they would see me. I attended holiday parties in dresses chosen carefully so Olivia would not mock me. I carried plates. I poured drinks. I cleaned up behind guests. I convinced myself that one day Linda would look at me and nod. Just once. And I would know I mattered. But standing in the glow of that wedding hall tonight, wine dripping across the white cloth, my sister's hand on my face, my father's word cutting through the silence, I realized I had been lying to myself for years. It was never going to be enough. The memory of past gatherings rushed in. I saw myself at 15, carrying trays at one of Linda's fundraisers. When Olivia had leaned down and whispered that I looked like the hired help, I remembered being 19, showing Linda my first acceptance letter to a non-profit fellowship, and her saying she hoped it would keep me busy until I got a real job. At 22, when I moved into my small apartment near Capitol Hill, Olivia laughed and asked if the building even had heat. Each insult, each slight, had stacked quietly inside me, stone upon stone, until tonight. When the whole structure finally collapsed, I thought of how Linda's friends had always looked past me, their conversations shifting back to Olivia's latest award. How even Robert, in the years he drifted at the edges of my life, never fought for me in front of them. And now, on the night when all I wanted was to help, to prove I belonged, he had joined them with one word. I walked faster, my legs carrying me blocks away from the hotel until the music and laughter were only echoes. The streets blurred as I remembered the ache of being the invisible child. The one no one clapped for. The one erased in every story Linda told about her family. I thought about the times I had convinced myself it did not matter, that my worth was not tied to them. Yet tonight proved how deep the wound still was. I stopped beneath a street lamp, my breath uneven. The truth of it all pressed heavy. For years, I had tried to stitch myself into a fabric that had already been cut to exclude me. The humiliation of the wedding was not an accident. It was the final confirmation of something I had sensed since childhood. In their eyes, I was not part of the Carter legacy. I was disposable, forgettable, useless. The sting on my cheek throbbed, as if to remind me. I pressed a hand to it, feeling the heat still there. I thought about the cameras at the wedding, the guests with their perfect hair and polished nails, all of them watching, as Olivia slapped me, and Robert joined in. The shame was unbearable. But under it, a flicker of something else began to form. Anger. I let myself stand in that anger. Let the memories of every insult and dismissal fuel it. It was not just about spilled wine. It was about years of silence. Years of being erased. Tonight had torn open every old wound, mixing them with the fresh one, until I could no longer tell where the past ended and the present began. I took a long breath, steadying myself under the dim light. I did not know what came next, but I knew I could not keep living as the forgotten daughter. Something had to change. And the cracks in my family had finally made it impossible to ignore. I reached my apartment long after midnight, the city's streets nearly empty, the neon glow of a corner store flickering in the distance as I unlocked the door. The moment I stepped inside, the silence wrapped around me, heavy and suffocating. I dropped my shoes by the door and collapsed onto the couch, the weight of the night pressing down until I could hardly breathe. My phone buzzed against my palm, and when I lifted it, the screen glared back with 2 unread messages. The first was from my mother, Linda. "Come back and apologize. You embarrassed Olivia on her wedding day." The second came from Olivia herself. "If you have even a shred of decency, you will admit you ruined everything." The words burned as much as the slap still stinging on my skin. Not a word of concern. Not a flicker of compassion. Only demands. I set the phone face down on the coffee table and leaned back, staring at the ceiling of my small Denver apartment. The paint was chipped near the vent, and the hum of the refrigerator in the corner filled the silence like static. It felt hollow, as if someone had scooped out the last pieces of who I thought I was and left nothing behind. The need to talk to someone pushed me to my feet. I grabbed my keys again, the metal cold in my hand, and drove through the quiet streets to Ryan Brooks's place. He lived across town, in a modest condo with brick walls and wide windows that looked out at the city lights. When he opened the door, his expression shifted instantly from confusion to concern. "You look like you've been through hell," he said softly, stepping aside to let me in. For the first time, I let myself consider the possibility that I did not have to keep begging for a seat at their table. Maybe the only way forward was to stop chasing what they would never give. I turned away from the hotel lights that still glowed faintly in the distance and started walking toward the city streets I knew. My chest ached. My face burned. But beneath it all, the flicker of resolve stayed lit. You've told me bits before. How your mom kept you from seeing him. Maybe there's more to the story than you know. I shook my head. Bitterness rising. He called me useless. Ryan. He stood there and watched me shatter. What more proof do I need? Ryan leaned back, folding his arms. Maybe he's angry now. Maybe he's wrong. But people don't just vanish from their children's lives without a reason. What if he tried and couldn't get through? What if your mother made it impossible? His words unsettled me. I wanted to push them away, to hold on to the certainty that my father had abandoned me. Because at least then, the pain had a clear shape. But a flicker of doubt broke through. Unwelcome and persistent. Ryan gestured toward the small bookshelf in the corner of my apartment. Didn't you say your mom shoved all your old stuff into boxes when you moved here? Letters. Photos. Whatever. Maybe you should look. The memory surfaced quickly, a cardboard box pushed into the back of my closet, filled with forgotten fragments of childhood. I had carried it from house to house without ever opening it. My stomach tightened. I don't know if I can, I whispered. Ryan reached over, placing a steady hand on mine. You don't have to do it tonight. But Emily, if there's a chance the story you grew up with isn't the truth, don't you want to know? He swallowed hard, torn between fear and curiosity. The thought that my mother and sister might have rewritten history gnawed at me. Had Robert really chosen to walk away? Or had something else forced him out? I left Ryan's later that night, my body heavy, but my mind restless. Back in my apartment, I stood in front of the closet, staring at the cardboard box shoved against the wall behind a stack of winter coats. My hands hovered at my sides, trembling. I wanted to rip it open, to demand answers. But I also feared what I might find. I pressed my palm against the rough cardboard, feeling the dust cling to my skin. All the years of silence, of longing for a father who never came, pressed into that box like a weight. I slid it out slowly, the scrape against the floor loud in the stillness of the room. Kneeling on the carpet, I lifted the lid and breathed in the smell of old paper and time. Inside were photo albums, report cards, birthday cards from relatives. My fingers moved through them, my chest tight, until they brushed against a folded envelope, yellowed with age. My name written across the front in handwriting I hadn't seen in years. I froze. My breath caught. The ink was familiar, sharp but slightly slanted. The way my father used to sign receipts. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might break through my ribs. The envelope trembled between my fingers as I turned it over. The seal still intact. For the first time since the wedding, something stirred inside me that was not shame or anger. It was the sharp edge of possibility, that maybe the story I had believed all these years was not the whole truth. I sat on the floor clutching the letter, the box still open beside me, unable to move further. The night outside pressed against the windows, and inside my small apartment, the weight of questions grew louder than the silence. My hands shook as I slid my finger under the brittle seal and tore it open. The paper inside was folded twice, creased from years of being hidden away. I unfolded it carefully, my chest tightening with every movement, and saw my name written at the top in handwriting I remembered from when I was a child. Dear Emily, it began. And my throat constricted before I could even continue. I read every word slowly, afraid that if I rushed, I might miss something that could explain the silence of the past decade. I never wanted to leave you. Your mother and sister made it impossible for me to stay. They wanted control of the restaurants, and I refused to run the business the way they demanded, cutting corners and chasing profit over people. I tried to call, I tried to write. Every attempt I made was blocked or returned. If you are reading this, it means one letter made it into your hands. My vision blurred as tears welled up. But I forced myself to keep reading. I opened a small coffee shop in Boulder to build something honest. I thought maybe one day you would find me. I do not want you to grow up thinking I chose to walk away. That has never been the truth. The letter grew heavier as it continued. Your mother and Olivia began taking money from the company soon after the divorce. I kept records where I could. One transfer of $25,000 went directly into Olivia's personal account. I tried to raise it, but Linda shut me out. She told me if I pushed, I would lose what little access I still had to you. I hope you will understand one day why I did not fight louder. I lowered the page into my lap, my hands trembling so hard the paper rattled. The room tilted as if the ground had shifted beneath me. For years I had carried the belief that my father had abandoned me without a word, that his absence meant I was not worth staying for. Now here it was, in his own handwriting, proof that he had tried, that my mother had cut every thread tying us together. But the words about Olivia twisted inside me like a knife. She had stolen from the business even then, when she was barely out of college, while Linda protected her and vilified my father. $25,000. The number rang in my head. A figure, large enough to change someone's life, stolen with a pen stroke and buried under silence. I pressed the paper against my knees and let the tears fall. They came hot and unrelenting. Not just for the girl who had grown up thinking her father didn't care, but for the years I had swallowed Olivia's mockery, Linda's dismissals, the endless shadow of never being enough. All the while, Olivia was not a shining success, but a thief hiding behind my mother's approval. I wiped my face with the back of my hand and forced myself to read the last lines. I will never stop hoping you come find me. Even if you do not, know that you were never unwanted. Love. Dad. I folded the letter carefully, my chest heaving with a storm I could not name. My mother's cold eyes, Olivia's smug laughter, my father's silence at the wedding, all collided in my mind. Everything I thought I knew about my family bent and cracked under the weight of this single sheet of paper. I stood up, pacing the room, clutching the letter in my hand. Anger surged through me. Then grief. Then something sharper. If Olivia had been stealing since 2014, what else had she taken? How many times had she cut corners? Lied. Hidden behind the mask of success, while Linda sang her praises. How many people had believed the image she crafted, while I had been branded the disappointment? I pressed my palm against the glass of the window, looking out at the city lights scattered across the dark. Somewhere out there, my father was running a coffee shop, probably closing the register, sweeping the floor, unaware that his words had just cracked open the world I lived in. I wanted to scream, to march back to my mother's house and throw the letter on her perfect dining table, to watch the facade crumble in front of her friends. But instead, I folded it again and slid it into the drawer of my nightstand. I knew this was only the beginning, the first piece of a truth that had been buried for more than a decade. The silence of my apartment felt different now. It no longer suffocated me with loneliness, but pulsed with questions demanding answers. What had Olivia done in the years since? How deep did Linda's lies run? And most of all, could my father still be out there waiting for me to knock on his door? I sat back on the edge of my bed, the drawer now shut but the weight of the letter still heavy in my chest. For the first time, the story I had been told my whole life no longer felt unshakable. The cracks were visible, sharp and undeniable, and through them a new path had begun to show. The morning sun slid through the blinds, streaking my room with lines of light I could not escape. I barely slept, the letter lying in the drawer like a heartbeat I could hear, even with my eyes closed. By the time the city began to stir, I had already decided what I had to do. I needed to see him. The drive from Denver to Boulder felt longer than the miles on the map. My hands gripped the steering wheel, knuckles pale as I rehearsed questions I wasn't sure I could ask. Every exit sign blurred past while my chest tightened with a mix of fear and anger. When the mountains rose in the distance, steady and timeless, I reminded myself that whatever waited for me could not hurt more than what had already been done. I found his coffee shop tucked on a quiet street corner, its brick walls faded but warm. A chalkboard outside listing the daily roast. The windows glowed with morning light, And through the glass, I saw him behind the counter, wiping down mugs. His hair was grayer than I remembered, his shoulders more hunched, but the shape of him was the same. My heart slammed against my ribs. I pushed the door open, and the bell above it chimed softly. He looked up. For a moment, neither of us moved, as if the air had thickened between us. His eyes widened, and I saw recognition flash across his face before his hand trembled, the cloth slipping from his fingers. "Emily," he said, barely a whisper, his voice rough, as if unused for too long. I nodded, unable to trust my voice. He came around the counter slowly, almost afraid I would vanish if he moved too quickly. When he reached me, he hesitated, then pulled me into a hug that felt both foreign and familiar. I stiffened at first, then let myself lean into it, inhaling the faint scent of coffee beans clinging to his shirt. I stepped back, blinking hard. "You wrote me." His eyes filled with something heavy. "I wrote you so many times. Your mother sent every letter back. She blocked my emails. I tried calling until the number was disconnected." He shook his head, pain etched deep. "She told you I left." My throat closed. "She did. She let me believe you walked away without a word." He swallowed, his jaw tightening. I wanted to fight, but every time I threatened to push, she said she would cut me off from you completely. I thought if I stayed quiet, at least you would know I was out there. It was the worst mistake of my life. I felt heat rise in my chest, anger and grief twisting together. All those years of silence, the empty birthdays, the school plays, I looked for him in vain. It had been a lie, crafted to erase him and make me believe I was unwanted. He motioned for me to sit at a small corner table. I followed, my hands still trembling. He reached under the counter and pulled out a worn leather folder, setting it on the table between us. His voice lowered. "I kept these because I knew one day the truth would matter." Inside were pages of old financial records from Carter Dining Group, neatly printed and marked with notes in his handwriting. One sheet showed a transfer of $25,000 in 2014, circled in red ink, labeled Olivia Personal Account. My breath caught. She did this while everyone called her a prodigy. She was stealing. Robert nodded, his eyes dark with regret. And it wasn't just once. She siphoned money in small amounts, disguised in vendor payments, bonuses that were never approved. Linda knew. She let it happen because Olivia was her shining star. I tried to stop it, but after the divorce, Linda owned most of the shares. I had no power left. I traced the ink with my finger, fury building with each detail. All the times I had been dismissed, laughed at, erased, while Olivia's image was polished like silver. It had all been built on lies and theft. "Why didn't you go public?" I asked, my voice sharp. "Why didn't you tell me?" His shoulders sagged. "Linda threatened legal action if I spoke. She said she would drag me through court until I had nothing left. I thought I was protecting you by staying quiet. But every day, I regretted it. The words hit me like stones. My life had been shaped by their silence, by lies layered over lies until I couldn't tell where truth began. Now the cracks had widened into a canyon. I leaned back in my chair, the folder open before me, the numbers staring back like proof of every betrayal. My chest rose and fell with uneven breaths. This is worse than I imagined. Robert reached across the table, his hand stopping short of mine. "Emily, I know I failed you. I let their threats silence me, but I want to make it right if you let me." I stared at him, torn between the longing of a child and the anger of an adult who had been left to drown. The part of me that wanted to believe in him ached, but the scars Linda and Olivia had left were too deep to ignore. I closed the folder gently, my voice quiet but steady. "You didn't just fail me. You let them control everything." He nodded, pain flickering in his eyes. "I know. And I will carry that until my last breath." The coffee shop around us buzzed softly, the hum of the espresso machine filling the silence. Outside, people strolled past, unaware that inside this corner cafe, The foundation of my family had just cracked beyond repair. I tucked the folder under my arm, the weight of it pressing against me. It wasn't just paper. It was the confirmation that every suspicion, every unease, had been real all along. I stood slowly, my chair scraping the floor. Robert looked at me as if searching for something he couldn't name. But I couldn't stay any longer. I needed space to breathe, to absorb the truth that had just shattered what little trust I still had in my family. As I stepped outside, the crisp mountain air hit my face, cooling the heat still burning in my chest. The folder was heavy in my arms, the numbers inside louder than words. For the first time, I no longer doubted that Olivia's success was a lie, propped up by theft and protected by silence. And with that truth in my hands, I knew nothing in my family would ever look the same again. I drove straight back to Denver, the folder resting on the passenger seat like a passenger of its own. Too loud to ignore. My hands tightened around the wheel, and every mile felt heavier. By the time I pulled into my apartment lot, my chest was buzzing with restless energy. I needed someone to help me make sense of it. Ryan opened the door before I had even knocked twice. He took one look at me, at the folder clutched against my chest, and stepped aside without a word. Inside, I set it down on his dining table and slid the papers toward him, his brows furrowed as he flipped through each page, his lips moving slightly as he read numbers, dates, and notes written in my father's handwriting. "This is serious, Emily," he said finally, his voice low but steady. "These aren't just mistakes." She was siphoning money directly into her account. I leaned against the chair, exhaustion pulling at me. That was 10 years ago. What if she stopped? Ryan shook his head. People like this don't stop. They get bolder when they think no one is watching. He pulled out his laptop, his fingers flying across the keys. I sat beside him, the hum of the fan filling the silence as he navigated through public filings, vendor contracts, and corporate disclosures for Carter Dining Group. "Look at this," he muttered, pointing at the screen. "Last year, 2024. There's an invoice to a vendor for $10,000. The vendor exists, but the work build was never completed. That money went missing." My stomach dropped. "She's still doing it." Ryan nodded grimly. "And she's sloppy. The trail is right here for anyone who knows how to look." I buried my face in my hands, anger coursing through me. All the dinners where Olivia had bragged about her success, all the magazine spreads praising her leadership. And underneath it was theft. Year after year, my mother had defended her every step of the way, blind or maybe willfully ignorant, while Ryan kept scanning. My phone buzzed on the table. A notification lit up the screen. Grace Miller posted a new video. My cousin. I clicked it, my breath catching as the clip began to play. The video was shaky, but clear enough. Olivia in her wedding gown, her hands striking my face. The sound sharp and undeniable. My father's voice followed, low and angry, calling me useless. Gasps rippled through the guests in the background, their faces turning toward the scene. The caption read simply, "This is what really happened at Olivia Carter's wedding." I stared at the screen, frozen. Ryan leaned closer, his eyes narrowing. "Emily, this already has thousands of views." Within minutes, comments flooded in, strangers voicing their outrage. Some wrote about the cruelty of hitting a sibling on a wedding day. Others asked how a father could stand by and call his daughter useless. A few recognized Olivia as the CEO featured in business magazines, tagging news outlets, questioning the Carter family's polished image. My hands trembled as I scrolled. Part of me wanted to shut it all down, to hide from the world, seeing my humiliation. But another part knew it was bigger than me now. The truth was out, and people were watching. Ryan placed a hand on my shoulder. "This is the first crack in their facade. They can't hide behind their perfect image anymore." I nodded slowly, my throat tight. The video replayed in my mind. But this time I did not just feel the sting of the slap. I saw it for what it was. Evidence of everything they had done to me for years. By the next morning, the clip had gone viral. It appeared on local feeds. Then on larger platforms, a Denver gossip blog picked it up, labeling it, "The Slap Heard at Cherry Creek." Reporters began circling, sniffing for more. Olivia's carefully crafted reputation as the poised, visionary CEO was unraveling with every share. Meanwhile, Ryan uncovered more. He found discrepancies in vendor payments dating back 3 years, each small enough to slip under casual review, but together forming a pattern of deliberate skimming. He compiled the records carefully, saving copies, encrypting files. She built her empire on lies, he said, his voice hard. And now the world is starting to see. I felt a strange mix of fear and relief. Fear, because I knew Olivia and my mother would not take this quietly. Relief because for once, I was not the only one carrying the weight of their cruelty. The world was peering in, and they could no longer dismiss me as invisible. I sat by the window that night, the glow of the city outside and Ryan's laptop humming beside me. The folder from my father lay open on the table, and the viral video played again on my phone. Two truths colliding. One, public and humiliating. The other buried in numbers and ink. Together, they painted a picture that no amount of charm or denial could erase. As the city lights flickered in the distance, I felt the tremor of something shifting. For the first time in years, the cracks in my family's perfect story were showing not just to me, but to everyone. And I knew this was only the beginning of what was about to come. My phone would not stop vibrating on the table, a steady hum that pulled me out of the trance I had been in since returning from Boulder. Notifications stacked one after another, each ping a reminder that the world outside was beginning to pay attention. The viral clip of Olivia slapping me and my father's voice calling me useless had already spread across platforms I never even used. Strangers were dissecting every second of the video, replaying the moment my humiliation became public property. For hours I sat frozen, caught between the desire to curl into myself and the urge to finally do something. The anger that had been simmering since the wedding boiled over into resolve. If I let the world believe the story was just about spilled wine and a slap, I would always be the victim. But if I spoke the full truth, if I showed the receipts behind Olivia's empire, maybe for the first time in my life, I could rewrite the role I had been forced into. I opened my laptop, the screen glaring white against the dim room. My hands hovered over the keys, trembling, then began to type. I wrote about that night in Cherry Creek, about standing in front of glittering guests in a gown that cost more than my year's salary and being struck across the face by my sister. I described the silence of my mother, the cruel word from my father. But I didn't stop there. I explained how Olivia had not built her success on brilliance or grit, but on theft. I told the story of the letter I had discovered, how my father had tried to reach me but was silenced, how he had kept evidence of transfers into Olivia's personal account. I wrote about the $25,000 she took in 2014, how the pattern continued in recent years, with vendor invoices that paid for nothing. I explained that Ryan had cross-checked filings showing money disappearing as recently as 2024. I kept names and account numbers vague, but I let people know I had proof in my possession. My tone was steady, not vindictive, but rough. When I pressed publish, my heart thudded so hard, I felt it in my throat. The post went live, and for a moment the apartment seemed unnervingly still. Then the comments started. At first it was friends from my nonprofit reposting my words with notes of support. They reminded me of long nights spent helping children with homework, of the way I had given myself to others when my own family dismissed me. Then came messages from acquaintances I barely remembered. People who had brushed past me at events, now saying they had always wondered why Linda and Olivia treated me so coldly. And then the floodgates opened wider. Former employees of Carter Dining Group found my post and began to comment. One said she remembered being told her wages were cut to protect profits, while Olivia drove away in a new luxury car. Another described signing inflated invoices under pressure, told it was standard practice. Others recounted moments of being berated in staff meetings, Tips disappearing before they reached servers. Managers terrified of crossing Olivia. Their voices layered over mine. Each story, another crack in the polished surface. My mother and sister had curated for years. It was no longer just my word against theirs. It was a chorus of testimonies that painted a picture of exploitation and greed. Ryan leaned over my shoulder, scrolling through the mounting comments. "This is spreading faster than the video," he said. And he was right. The clip showed cruelty, but the post revealed corruption. Together they told a story no press release could clean up. The non-profit community rallied around me. Colleagues reshared my words with calls for accountability, pointing out how power dynamics in families often mirrored those in corporations. They framed it as more than gossip, more than family drama. It was about truth and responsibility. By late afternoon, the notifications blurred together. My phone lit up with an email that made me stop breathing for a moment. Denver Post inquiry request for interview. I read the subject line 3 times before clicking. The reporter introduced herself, said she had seen the viral clip and my statement online, and wanted to give me a chance to tell my story in full. They were already hearing from ex-employees with corroborating accounts. They wanted my evidence. I closed my laptop for a moment, pressing my palms against my eyes. Fear rushed in, cold and sharp. If I stepped into the public eye, there would be no going back. My family would come after me harder than ever. Olivia Slavers, Linda's connections. Every ounce of their wealth would be weaponized. But then another thought followed. Warmer, steadier. For years I had been invisible. For years I had begged for scraps of recognition. And now, for once, I was being asked to speak because what I carried mattered. I looked at Ryan. My voice, barely a whisper. "What if I can't handle it?" He shook his head, his expression unwavering. "You already are." You spoke up. You turned humiliation into truth. That's more than most people ever do. I felt tears prick the corners of my eyes. Not from sadness, but from the weight of being believed. For so long my words had fallen flat in my mother's kitchen, drowned out by Olivia's laughter. Now thousands of strangers were listening. That evening I refreshed the post and saw it had been shared hundreds of times. Threads of conversation spun out on platforms I had never used. People debating the story, dissecting every detail. Some doubted me. Of course. Some accused me of jealousy or timing my words to destroy Olivia's wedding glow. But far more stood in my corner. They demanded accountability. They tagged journalists. They compared my story to other high-profile scandals where the powerful had been exposed. I sat by the window as the city darkened, scrolling through the voices of strangers who suddenly cared about the daughter my family had erased. The lights of Denver blinked across the skyline, indifferent and steady. But inside me, something had shifted. I wasn't just the girl humiliated at her sister's wedding anymore. I wasn't just the disappointment in my mother's eyes. I was the one who had finally chosen to speak. To pull the curtain back on the truth they had hidden for years. Lying back on the couch, exhaustion settled heavy into my bones. But beneath it all, a pulse of strength remained. My cheeks still remembered the sting of Olivia's slap. My ears still rang with my father's word. But tonight, I carried something stronger than their cruelty. Tonight, I carried my voice. And the world was finally listening. The summons came 2 days later in the form of a sharply worded email. The message carried the letterhead of a Denver law firm and requested my presence at a meeting with counsel for Olivia and Linda Carter. The tone was polite, but firm. A thin veil stretched over what was clearly an attempt to intimidate me. I stared at the screen, my stomach tightening, and then forwarded it to Ryan. He skimmed it quickly and looked at me with steady eyes. "You do not have to go. But maybe you should. They want to scare you. You can show them you are not afraid." The following afternoon, I walked into the glass tower that housed Hayes and Associates. The lobby gleamed with marble floors and brass fixtures, the air faintly scented with cologne and power. I carried no folder, no papers, just myself. For once that felt like enough. A receptionist led me to a conference room with walls of glass overlooking the city. Inside sat Olivia in a tailored blazer, her expression sculpted into confidence, and Linda, in a pale suit, her hands twisting a gold bracelet around her wrist. At the head of the table was Daniel Hayes, a man in his mid-40s, with slicked-back hair and a practiced smile. He rose as I entered. Extending a hand, I ignored, and gestured for me to sit. "Thank you for coming." He began smoothly. "We believe it is in everyone's best interest to resolve this matter quietly." I slid into the chair opposite my mother and sister. Folding my hands in my lap, Olivia's eyes burned into me, daring me to flinch. Mr. Hayes opened a folder and slid a document across the table. "This is a settlement agreement. My clients are prepared to offer you $250,000. In exchange, you will remove your post, issue a statement retracting your claims, and agree never to discuss these matters again." The paper sat between us like a weapon. I glanced at the number typed in bold. A figure that could change the course of my modest life. Pay off debts. Buy me years of freedom, for a fleeting second temptation whispered. But the moment passed as quickly as it came. I saw Olivia's smug smile, Linda's pleading eyes, the years of dismissal and cruelty that had led me here. I pushed the paper back across the table. "No." Hayes's smile faltered. "Perhaps you need time to consider." I shook my head. "I do not need time. I am not here for your money." Olivia leaned forward, her voice sharp. "You think this is about justice? You are pathetic. You are jealous because you will never have what I built." I met her glare steadily. "What you built was on stolen money and lies. I am not retracting the truth." Her composure cracked, her face flushing. "You will regret this. You are burning every bridge you have left." Linda finally spoke, her tone soft and pleading. "Emily, please. This scandal is tearing our family apart. Think about our name. About how we look in the community." Her words struck me harder than I expected, but not in the way she intended. For years I had chased the idea of protecting the Carter name, bending myself into silence so they could shine. Now the thought of it rang hollow. I looked at her, my voice calm but sharp. "You protected Olivia. You never protected me. Family is not an excuse for covering theft." Daniel Hayes cleared his throat, his smooth tone trying to regain control. "Miss Carter, I urge you to reconsider. Public disputes damage everyone. This settlement is generous." I stood, my chair scraping the polished floor. "I am not signing anything. My evidence speaks louder than your threats." Olivia slammed her hand on the table, startling even the lawyer. "You are nothing without us. Emily, nothing." I leaned forward just enough for her to see. I meant every word. "I am done being nothing in your shadow." The silence that followed was sharp enough to cut. Linda lowered her gaze to the table, her bracelet slipping down her wrist. Hayes shuffled his papers, trying to mask the tension. Olivia glared at me, her jaw tight, her nails digging into her palm. I straightened my shoulders and walked to the door. Each step felt lighter than the last. Behind me, Olivia's voice rang out, sharp and venomous. "You will regret this." I did not look back. The hallway outside smelled faintly of polished wood and disinfectant, a strange blend of power and emptiness as the elevator doors closed around me. My reflection stared back. My face was calm, my hands steady. For the first time, I realized I had stood at the same table as my mother and sister. Not begging, not shrinking, but equal. And I had walked away without their money, without their approval, but with something far stronger. The story broke wide open the morning after my meeting at Hayes & Associates. My phone lit up before I had even made coffee. Headlines flashing across the screen. Local blogs had picked up my post, pairing it with the viral wedding clip. And from there, the story climbed to larger outlets. Words like scandal and financial misconduct appeared next to my sister's name. Her smiling photos pulled from magazine features, now recycled under a different light. I sat at my kitchen table, scrolling through article after article. Denver Business Weekly had published a piece titled, "Carter Dining Group Faces Allegations of Embezzlement." The Denver Post quoted anonymous former employees describing hostile management and suspicious bookkeeping. A local television station ran the clip of Olivia's slap, blurring my face, but not hers. While the anchor explained viewers would soon see more on alleged financial irregularities, Ryan came by mid-morning with takeout breakfast sandwiches and a grin that was equal parts relief and caution. "You lit the fuse," he said, setting the bag on the table. "Now the fire's spreading," I nodded. Still stunned. My little apartment had become the eye of a storm I had unleashed. Notifications poured in faster than I could keep up. Some were supportive messages from strangers, others angry threats from faceless accounts, and a handful from old classmates marveling that the Carter family's perfect veneer had finally cracked. By noon, the fallout grew tangible. An investor who had been in talks to fund a new Carter Dining Group expansion announced he was pulling out of the deal. A $150,000 loss. That made headlines of its own. The statement cited concerns about the company's leadership and pending investigations. I read the press release twice, my chest tightening with something between vindication and disbelief. Olivia had always boasted that investors lined up at her door, that she was the kind of visionary people trusted with their money. Now the same names she flaunted were backing away, leaving her to answer questions she could not control. The local television station ran a longer segment that evening. The anchor's voice was measured, careful, but the message cut clean. Carter Dining Group, once considered a model of Denver's dining scene, was now under scrutiny after reports of suspicious financial transactions. The piece included interviews with former waitstaff describing wage cuts, missing tips, and inflated invoices. They blurred names and faces, but the testimonies were damning. I watched from my couch, knees pulled to my chest. Ryan beside me, with his arm draped loosely around my shoulders. Hearing other voices confirm what I knew made it feel real in a way even my father's folder had not. It was no longer just my family's dark secret. It was public record. Across town. Olivia and Linda were not silent. Their lawyer released a statement calling my claims baseless. The work of a disgruntled family member, with an agenda? They called me unstable, accused me of seeking attention. The words stung even as I expected them. I had been called worse within the walls of my own home, but now those insults were out in the open, flung at me in front of strangers. The public reaction was not what they had counted on. Online threads tore apart the statement, pointing to the number of ex-employees backing my claims. Commentators asked, why? If I was lying. So many people from different restaurants told the same story. The clip of the slap played again and again, framed as symbolic of the Carter family's culture, where cruelty reigned behind polished surfaces. For the first time in years, Olivia's name was not followed by applause. It was followed by questions. That night, my phone buzzed with another email. This one from a national outlet. They wanted to schedule an interview to expand the story beyond Denver. I stared at the message until the words blurred. The weight of it pressed heavy. This had started as my family's poison, and now it was spilling across the country. Ryan noticed my silence and squeezed my hand. "You don't have to answer them yet. Take a breath." I nodded, grateful. But I knew the wave would not wait long. By the end of the week, the Carter empire looked different. Reservations at their flagship restaurant dropped sharply. Yelp pages filled with reviews, not about the food, but about the scandal. Hashtags tied to Olivia's name trended locally. A mix of mockery and outrage. Linda, once a fixture in women's business circles, was quietly removed from a city advisory board, her reputation collapsing alongside her daughter's. I walked downtown one afternoon, passing a newsstand where the Denver Post front page showed a photograph of Olivia at a charity event, her smile bright and polished, next to a headline about ongoing investigations. I stared at the image, remembering her hand against my face, and felt a surge of something close to justice. But justice was not finished yet. The articles spoke of discrepancies, of allegations, of pending reviews. Nothing was final. They still had lawyers, money, and influence. They would fight to the end to keep their empire afloat. That night, I sat on my balcony. The city lights glowing steady. The cool air brushing against my skin. My phone buzzed again with messages I ignored. I thought of the folder from my father. The records Ryan had uncovered. The courage it had taken for employees to speak. All of it now carried weight beyond me. The storm was no longer gathering. It had already broken. Tearing through the illusion of perfection, Linda and Olivia had spent decades building, and for the first time, the world was not applauding them. The world was demanding answers. The letter from Olivia's attorney arrived folded neatly in an envelope with heavy cream paper, as if expensive stationery could disguise its venom. Inside, the words were cold and sharp. Defamation. Damages. Legal action if I did not remove my posts. My fingers trembled as I read, though my chest felt oddly steady. This was the move I had expected. They wanted to crush me under paperwork and fear, to turn the tide back in their favor. I called Ryan immediately. He read the letter over my shoulder, then exhaled slowly. They are bluffing. But you can't face this alone. Let's talk to someone who knows how to handle people like them. Through my nonprofit work, I had contacts in the legal aid community. A colleague put me in touch with a pro bono attorney named Michael Harrington, a man with salt and pepper hair, a worn leather briefcase, and eyes that missed nothing. When I walked into his office in downtown Denver the next day, I carried the envelope in my bag and a knot of anxiety in my stomach. He greeted me with a firm handshake, then gestured toward a chair across from his cluttered desk. "Tell me everything," he said simply. I laid it out for him. The slap, the word my father had hurled, the viral clip, the posts I had written, the financial records from my father's folder, Ryan's findings in public filings. Finally, I slid the threatening letter across the desk. He read it carefully, his brow furrowing only slightly. When he looked up, his expression was calm. "This is standard intimidation. They want you rattled. But Emily, the truth is on your side. If even half of what you just told me is documented, Olivia will have a very difficult time proving defamation." My breath escaped in a rush. I had not realized I was holding. "So they can't win." "Not with what you have," Michael replied. "You have financial records, corroborating testimony from former employees, and a viral video that shows physical aggression. Their own behavior is undermining their credibility. If they push this to court, discovery could expose even more of their misconduct. Frankly, I would welcome the chance to question Olivia under oath." The thought startled me. I had walked into his office feeling hunted, cornered. But now he was talking about putting them on the defensive. He leaned forward, his voice steady. "Here is what I recommend. We file a formal response rejecting their claims, backed by the evidence you already hold. We secure affidavits from former employees willing to testify, and we make it clear that if they pursue this, we will countersue." Countersue. The word tasted strange, powerful, like a weapon I never thought I could wield. For so long my family had dictated the terms. Now I had someone willing to fight for me. Michael studied me for a long moment. "I know this is your family. That makes it complicated. But in the eyes of the law, this is business. And legally, they do not have the upper hand." I nodded slowly, letting the truth sink in. For years I had been the one with no defense, the one enduring their cruelty in silence. Now I had a lawyer, a plan, and leverage. When I left his office, the air outside felt different. The courthouse across the street loomed tall against the sky, its stone facade imposing, but for once it did not intimidate me. I walked down the steps with my head higher, the envelope of threats tucked away, no longer heavy. That evening, I met Ryan at a coffee shop, sliding into the booth with a quiet smile. "How was it?" he asked, his eyes searching mine. I told him everything. The way Michael had dismantled the threat, the confidence in his voice, the plan to counter if Olivia dared push further. Ryan grinned, relief flooding his features. So you're not just defending yourself anymore. You're fighting back. I wrapped my hands around the warm mug of coffee and let myself breathe. For the first time since the wedding, I did not feel like prey. I felt like someone who had armor. As the days passed, the weight of fear began to shift. Olivia and Linda continued their public denials. Their lawyer repeated phrases about lies and slander. But now I had more than words to hold on to. I had legal backing. Evidence secured. Witnesses ready. The balance had changed. Sitting in my apartment late one night, I opened the drawer where my father's letter still rested. The ache of betrayal was still there. But it was no longer the only thing I carried. Next to it, now were the records, affidavits, and a lawyer's card that meant I was not alone in this fight. The glow from the city lights pressed against the window, and I let myself feel the smallest trace of peace. For once, I was not waiting for the next blow. I was ready to deliver my own. The announcement came on a gray Monday morning. Colorado's Department of Regulatory Agencies released a statement confirming a formal investigation into Carter Dining Group. It was printed in black and white on their official site, then picked up instantly by every news outlet. My phone buzzed relentlessly as headlines spread. State launches probe into Denver's premier restaurant group. Allegations of embezzlement and workplace abuse under review. I sat at my kitchen table holding the screen in my hand, my heart racing. It was no longer whispers or online outrage. This was official. Government scrutiny that Linda and Olivia could not wave away with charm or lawyers. Within days, subpoenas were issued. I heard from Michael that investigators had requested payroll records, vendor contracts, and bank statements. Former employees were invited to give testimony. Some of them reached out to me directly through social media, thanking me for speaking first. One woman wrote that she had waited years for someone to finally pull the curtain back. Another man described managers pocketing tips and staff too afraid to complain. Their voices joined together, each story reinforcing the next. The pressure on Olivia mounted quickly. Photos of her leaving her downtown office building were splashed across news sites, her face tight with anger as reporters shouted questions. Linda tried to maintain her composure in public, but cracks showed. She was quietly removed from the Denver Women in Business Council, a board she had served on for years. An official statement cited reputational concerns. Her polished image of mentorship and leadership collapsed overnight. The investigation culminated in a public hearing at the state capitol. Rows of seats filled with journalists, ex-employees, and curious onlookers. I arrived early with Michael and Ryan, my hands trembling despite the strength I had gathered over the past weeks. Walking into the chamber, I felt the weight of every year I had been silenced. Across the room, Olivia sat stiffly beside her attorney, her dark blazer sharp against the pale wood of the benches. Linda was next to her, head bowed slightly, lips pressed tight. For once, neither of them looked untouchable. They looked cornered. The hearing began with testimony from former staff. A young man described working 80-hour weeks, only to see his paychecks docked for mysterious fees. A woman spoke about tips that never reached servers, diverted into a general fund Olivia controlled. Another described being pressured to sign off on inflated invoices for supplies that never arrived. Each account was detailed, steady, undeniable. I watched Olivia shift in her seat, her jaw clenching tighter with every story. Linda stared at the table, refusing to meet the eyes of the people she had once brushed off as replaceable. When it was my turn, I walked to the front with my knees shaking but my back straight. I told them what I had seen in the records my father kept. How the $25,000 transfer in 2014 was only the beginning. I explained how Ryan had traced more recent invoices, how the paper trail showed a pattern too clear to ignore. My voice wavered once, but I forced myself to steady it. For years I had been branded useless. Now my words carried weight. When I returned to my seat, Ryan squeezed my hand under the table. Michael gave me a nod, his expression calm but proud. By the end of the day, the tide had shifted completely. The panel announced that the investigation would proceed with heightened scrutiny and potential referral to the Attorney General's office. Reporters rushed out to file stories before the evening news. Olivia stormed from the chamber without looking at anyone. cameras flashing as she shoved past. Linda, linga longa. Her shoulders slumped. Her face drained of the confidence she had once worn like armor. I sat in the quiet afterward, the room emptying slowly, and let the reality wash over me. I had faced them directly. Not at a family dinner where they could dismiss me, but in a room where truth mattered. And this time, they could not silence me. Vex, Lotter. I moved into a new apartment in Capitol Hill. The hardwood floors creaked under my steps. The windows opened to a view of the skyline, and boxes still lined the walls waiting to be unpacked. It was small, but it was mine. No hand-me-down furniture from Linda. No reminders of Olivia's shadow. Just a space I had chosen. I stood in the living room, surrounded by the faint smell of fresh paint and cardboard, feeling lighter than I had in years. The noise of the city filtered in through the glass, steady and constant. For the first time, the chaos outside no longer frightened me. It reminded me that life went on. And so would I. The empire that had loomed over me my whole life was crumbling piece by piece. And as I set a lamp down on the windowsill, the glow spilling across the floor, I realized I had finally stepped into the light myself. The next morning, I laced up my shoes and headed toward Cheeseman Park. The air, cool and sharp with the scent of early fall. The sky stretched wide and clean, and the leaves whispered in the trees as if reminding me that everything, even the strongest branches, eventually changes. I walked slowly along the gravel path, letting the rhythm of my steps ease the tension still lingering in my body. For months I had carried the weight of humiliation, betrayal, and silence. I remembered the sting of Olivia's hand across my face, the shame that burned when my father called me useless in front of a crowd. I remembered the way my mother's eyes had turned away, as if my pain was an inconvenience not worth acknowledging. Those memories had haunted me, like shadows. I could not escape. But now, after hearings and headlines and truths laid bare, those shadows had finally begun to recede. I stopped by a bench and sat, pulling my jacket tighter around me as a breeze swept across the grass. Children ran in circles nearby, their laughter rising into the clear air. I watched them for a while, and thought about the kids at the nonprofit, the ones who clung to hope despite language barriers, poverty, or parents working 3 jobs to keep food on the table. Their courage had been my anchor when my own family stripped me of self-worth. Helping them had reminded me again and again that being dismissed at home did not make me meaningless. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out, expecting another notification from reporters or messages from strangers. But the name froze me in place. Dad. For a moment I stared at the screen, my thumb hovering uncertainly. Then I pressed accept and lifted it to my ear. "Hi," I said, my voice unsteady. There was a pause. Then Robert's voice, rough and quieter than I remembered. "Emily, I wanted to tell you that I saw you at the hearing. You stood there stronger than I ever imagined. I am proud of you." Tears pricked my eyes. Uninvited, but impossible to hold back. "Thank you," I whispered. He hesitated, then went on. "I know I cannot undo what happened. I cannot erase the years I let slip away. But I do not want to lose the time we still have. If you are willing, maybe we can meet. Just us. A father and his daughter." The ache of longing and hurt that had lived inside me for years cracked open. I leaned forward, pressing my free hand to my forehead. "I would like that," I said softly. We chose a small diner in Boulder for the weekend, a neutral place where we could start again. When I hung up, I sat motionless on the bench, staring at the trees swaying above me. The word useless no longer echoed in my head. It had been replaced by something new. A possibility that maybe I could still have a father. Imperfect but present. I rose and continued my walk, each step steadier than the last. As I wound through the park, I thought about how far I had come, from that night in the hotel ballroom where humiliation swallowed me, to the moment I chose to publish my truth, to standing in front of officials as Olivia and Linda's empire cracked apart. Each step of the journey had carved away the illusion that I needed their approval. Back in my Capitol Hill apartment, I unpacked another box, setting books along the shelf and smoothing a blanket across the couch. The place was still sparse, but it felt like mine. No furniture chosen to please Linda. No decor to match Olivia's taste. Only pieces I had picked. Humble but real. When the sunlight streamed through the tall window, catching the edges of the hardwood floor, I felt a kind of peace I had never known in the Carter household. I thought about Olivia and Linda often, but the feelings had shifted. Once I burned for their recognition, their apology, their love. Now all I felt was distance. Their empire had been built on exploitation and deception. It was crumbling under the weight of truth. And I no longer wanted to be anywhere near the rubble. That evening my phone lit up again with messages. Supporters from the nonprofit community thanked me for speaking. Strangers sent notes about their own toxic families. And journalists continued to request interviews. For the first time, instead of shrinking, I allowed myself to read them. People saw me, not as a failure or an afterthought, but as someone who stood up against what was wrong. As the city settled into night, I brewed tea and carried the mug to the window. Denver stretched below, alive with lights and movement. I thought about the girl I had been, standing in her sister's shadow, silenced at the dinner table, hiding her passion for community work because it was dismissed as small. That girl had been told she was useless. But she was the one who had found courage, spoken truth, and chosen herself. I lifted the mug, holding it steady as if in a silent toast to the girl I had been, to the woman I had become. When I finally turned off the lights and lay down, the quiet no longer felt suffocating. It felt safe, like the start of something new. To everyone who has been here with me through this story, thank you. Thank you for listening, for sharing, for reminding me that voices matter even when families try to silence them. If this story touched you, I would love for you to share your thoughts in the comments, to subscribe and stay with me for more, and to pass this on to someone who might need to hear it. I am Emily Carter, and I am not useless. I never was. I simply chose myself.